In a quiet Connecticut town, a young mother was found dead in her bed, her home undisturbed, her front door ajar, and her 6-month-old baby missing without a trace. What investigators discovered beneath that house would expose a nightmare decades in the making. On a cold November morning in the small town of Willow Ridge, Connecticut, the pale blue house on Larchwood Lane stood unnervingly still. Frost clung to the windows like a thin layer of dust, and the quiet street looked the same as it always did. But something felt wrong. The front door of the Kane residence, usually shut tight, was left slightly open. It wasn't wide enough to seem like forced entry, yet not narrow enough to be dismissed as an accident. It hung in a careless way that made neighbors pause and stare each time they passed by. A couple walking their dog was the first to notice. They hesitated, unsure if they should investigate. The Kane house didn't usually draw attention. Marissa Kane, a 27-year-old single mother, kept a predictable routine. She left early for work at a local design studio, returned home by mid-afternoon, and rarely had visitors. Her 6-month-old daughter, Eden, was always with her. People in Willow Ridge described Marissa as gentle, private, and dependable. Nothing about her life hinted at danger. When police arrived for the welfare check, the air inside the home felt oddly heavy. The living room was neat, almost too neat. Toys were lined up with perfect precision, a baby blanket folded carefully on the couch. A faint scent of lavender hung in the air, as if someone had recently tried to mask something unpleasant. Officers moved slowly, taking in every detail. Nothing was tipped over, nothing appeared broken. There were no obvious signs of intrusion, yet something about the stillness felt wrong, as though the house itself was holding its breath. A trail of damp footprints broke the order. They began near the entryway and stretched toward the back hallway, fading gradually as if someone had taken time to wipe the edges of each print. The footprints didn't match anything from the officers who entered. They didn't match the weather outside either. The morning frost had been dry. There was no rain, no melted snow. The moisture seemed out of place. As officers followed the trail, the house grew colder. The hallway led to Marissa's bedroom. Inside, the scene changed from strange to tragic. Marissa lay motionless on her bed, her body positioned almost peacefully, as though she had simply drifted off to sleep. But her stillness was absolute. Her skin had lost its warmth. The room around her held no signs of a struggle, no scattered objects, no damage. It was as if someone had entered the room, ended her life quietly, and left without disturbing a single thing. The most chilling detail was the silence. The house held no sound other than the soft hum of the heater. And in a home where a baby lived, silence felt unnatural. Officers checked the crib in the adjoining room. It was empty. The toys inside had not shifted. The soft sheets were perfectly smooth. Baby Eden, who should have been there, was missing. No note, no trail, no sound of departure. Nothing to explain why a young mother lay dead in her bed while her infant daughter had vanished without leaving so much as a single clue. Detectives entered the investigation believing that a crime this devastating would leave behind something obvious: a fingerprint, a broken latch, a disturbed piece of furniture, anything that could point them toward whoever had entered the Kane home. Instead, they were met with a disturbing emptiness. The house seemed untouched, almost carefully preserved, as though someone had moved through it with practiced caution. The few damp footprints that had first caught their attention now felt less like a mistake by the intruder and more like an intentional tease, a hint left behind without real value. Crime scene technicians examined every surface for trace evidence. Counters, doorknobs, and light switches were dusted and scanned. Floors were inspected with alternate light sources. Even the fibers and the carpet were checked for foreign strands, yet nothing stood out. It was as if the person who entered the home had worn a layer of invisibility. No prints, no hair, no skin cells, and no other biological material were found. The only sign of disruption was the absence of baby Eden. The empty crib became the central focus of the room. It was impossibly neat for a space where an infant slept. There were no signs of sudden movement or distress. The blanket was folded as if placed deliberately, not tossed aside. A pacifier sat on the edge of the mattress, positioned perfectly. Detectives considered whether Marissa herself might have removed Eden from the crib shortly before her death, but the room's quiet order suggested otherwise. Everything seemed staged, arranged with care and purpose. Investigators then shifted their attention to entry points. Every window and door in the house was examined. The locks were intact, and there were no scratches or marks indicating forced entry. The front door, though found slightly open, had no damage and no sign of tampering. It appeared the person who entered either had a key or came in through a door that had been unlocked. But those who knew Marissa insisted she was meticulous about securing her home, especially after Eden's birth. She never left the door unlocked, not even for a quick trip to the mailbox. Neighbors were questioned repeatedly. The houses along Larchwood Lane were close enough that any loud activity would usually draw attention. Yet not a single neighbor reported hearing anything unusual the night before. No shouting, no footsteps outside, no car pulling into the driveway at a strange hour. It was as though the crime had unfolded without making a single sound. Even the family dog across the street, known for barking at anyone who approached, had stayed silent all night. Police then turned their focus to Marissa's personal life. They dug into her finances, her workplace, her relationships, and her social circle. They looked for signs of conflict, hidden struggles, or secret connections. Nothing emerged. Her bank accounts showed no suspicious activity. Her co-workers described her as quiet and kind, with no professional disputes. Those who knew her socially said she had no enemies, no troubled partnerships, and no recent concerns or fears she had shared. The more investigators learned about Marissa, the more unsettling the mystery became. Her life was calm, predictable, and ordinary. Nothing in her history suggested danger. Yet danger had entered her home without warning, taken her life, and stolen her child. And with every hour that passed, the trail grew colder, offering no direction, no motive, and no clear suspect. The disappearance of baby Eden now stood at the center of a puzzle with no edges, no form, and no beginning. A week after the initial investigation, frustration settled over the team assigned to the case. Every lead had dissolved into nothing. Every potential clue had turned out to be a dead end. The house felt like a sealed box that refused to reveal its secrets. Wanting to avoid missing anything, detectives requested a second, more detailed forensic sweep of the property. This time, they brought in specialists trained to identify structural anomalies, hidden compartments, and overlooked evidence. Their expertise would soon uncover something that altered the direction of the case completely. The team began in the basement, a space that seemed ordinary at first glance. It was dim, lined with old wooden shelves, and filled with untouched storage bins left behind by previous owners. Dust coated almost everything, creating a muted, undisturbed landscape. But amid the stillness, one of the examiners noticed a faint vertical line on the far wall, a subtle indentation that didn't match the surrounding pattern. It was so slight that it looked like a natural flaw in the cement, something most people would never question. Still, the examiner felt uneasy about it. With careful tools and steady hands, they tapped along the wall. A hollow sound echoed back. Further inspection revealed a concealed entry disguised behind thin paneling that had been painted to match the rest of the basement. Once opened, the narrow space inside felt colder than the rest of the room, as though it had been sealed for a long time. Dust was thinner here, suggesting more recent use. The hidden room was small, hardly more than a closet, yet its contents were chilling. Stacked neatly on a shelf was a collection of old newspapers, all featuring missing infants from various New England towns. The dates stretched back nearly 20 years. Some of the clippings were yellowed with age, others more recent. Each article had been carefully cut out and preserved. A folded map of the northeastern United States lay beneath the newspapers, marked with small circles around certain towns. Every circled location matched one of the infant disappearances. The pattern was undeniable. Beside the map sat a black notebook filled with handwriting that was both precise and unsettling. Page after page contained lists of dates, names, and brief notes. None of the names referenced Marissa or anyone connected to her. Instead, the entries appeared to track people entirely unknown to investigators. Some pages had been ripped out, leaving jagged edges. Others had ink that had bled slightly, as if exposed to moisture at some point. The meaning behind the notes remained unclear, but the volume and organization suggested long-term planning. The final discovery in the hidden room was a faded photograph taped to the back wall. It showed a baby wrapped in a blanket, photographed in black and white decades earlier. At first, it seemed unremarkable, just another relic from the past. But upon closer inspection, detectives noticed a small crescent-shaped birthmark near the infant's right ear, the same distinctive mark baby Eden had. The resemblance was unmistakable. This revelation sent a ripple of unease through the team. The room did not belong to Marissa, and its existence suggested someone had been using the space long before she moved in. The presence of decades-old materials and the eerie photograph implied a history that stretched well beyond Marissa's time in the house. Whoever created this hidden room had an obsession that spanned years. It raised a terrifying possibility. The person responsible for Eden's disappearance might have been connected to the house itself, watching its occupants over time, choosing their moments carefully. With the basement's secret exposed, investigators realized the crime was part of something much larger, something that had been unfolding quietly in the shadows for far longer than anyone had imagined. As investigators pieced together the meaning of the hidden room, a new theory began to form, one that pointed toward long-term surveillance rather than a sudden attack. The idea unsettled the entire team. If someone had been watching the house for years, slipping in and out without being detected, it meant the intruder had a deep familiarity with the property and its residents. This wasn't an impulsive crime, but something deliberate, meticulous, and rooted in an unsettling pattern. Detectives expanded their search beyond the house and into the neighborhood's history. They combed through old police reports and found to previous homeowners who had reported mysterious break-ins. Nothing had been stolen during those incidents. Instead, the intruder had moved things slightly out of place, books rearranged, kitchen drawers left open by half an inch, a chair shifted by just a few degrees. At the time, officers had dismissed these occurrences as pranks or the mistakes of the homeowners themselves. Now the similarities were impossible to ignore. The house had been watched and entered repeatedly long before Marissa ever stepped inside. When investigators began interviewing neighbors again, they approached the task with a new mindset. Rather than focusing on the night of the crime, they asked about unusual sightings in the months leading up to it. A man living to streets over shared a detail that had seemed harmless at the time. He recalled seeing a solitary figure walking behind the Kane property during late summer, always wearing the same dark hooded jacket. The figure moved slowly and deliberately, showing no interest in the surrounding homes. When the neighbors' eyes met theirs one evening, the figure paused for a moment before disappearing into a cluster of trees without making a sound. The neighbor never reported it because nothing outright threatening had occurred. This account unsettled detectives further. If the intruder was confident enough to roam the area openly, even briefly, they likely felt they belonged there in some way. Perhaps they had lived nearby, perhaps they had grown up in the area. The familiarity suggested someone who knew escape paths, blind spots, and vulnerabilities that others would miss. Investigators then turned back to the map found in the hidden room. The circled towns formed a loose arc across the region. Each one corresponded with a missing infant case. Most of the incidents had occurred quietly, receiving little attention beyond local communities. Detectives reviewed old files from these towns and found a chilling pattern. The missing infants were all under 1 year old, taken at night, and never found. In several cases, no suspects had ever been identified. The more towns they examined, the clearer the pattern became. Someone had been abducting infants across multiple states for nearly 2 decades. The most disturbing detail was that each crime occurred within driving distance of Larchwood Lane. The house seemed to be the center of the map. It wasn't just a place where Marissa lived, it was a location the kidnapper had used as a base at various times. The hidden room began to look less like a random secret and more like a workspace maintained across the years. Detectives considered the possibility that the intruder returned periodically, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The quiet summer sightings could have been part of this preparation, a period of watching and studying. Marissa's predictable routines may have made her an easy target, not because of who she was, but because of where she lived. This theory led to a grim realization: the criminal behind these events wasn't a random predator passing through. They were someone who operated with a long-term plan, someone who selected homes based on purpose, not people. The focus wasn't Marissa, it was the house itself. And if that was true, then the intruder likely had far more knowledge of the property, its layout, and its weaknesses than anyone could have imagined. 3 months after Eden's disappearance, the case had grown colder than anyone wanted to admit. Investigators continued searching, but each new lead unraveled quickly, leaving them with nothing but unanswered questions. The discovery of the hidden room and the map of circled towns had widened the investigation across multiple states, yet none of those older cases offered clues that brought them closer to the kidnapper. Each crime seemed to vanish into the same void. Still, detectives persisted, believing that one overlooked detail might bring the truth to the surface. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when a woman in northern Vermont contacted authorities about strange noises coming from a remote cabin deep in the woods. She had been hiking near the area for several days and kept hearing faint crying during the night. At first, she assumed it was an animal, but the sound had an unmistakably human tone, soft but persistent. When she approached the cabin one evening, she saw a dim light flickering inside. Something about the scene felt wrong, so she backed away and called local authorities. Officers arrived at the cabin early the next morning. The structure was old and worn down, with rotting wooden beams and foggy windows that barely let in light. Inside, however, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Instead of the expected dust and decay, the interior contained items that appeared recently placed. A small cradle sat in the center of the single room, far too new for the rustic surroundings. Shelves held stolen baby clothes, neatly folded and sorted by size. Beside them were passports and identification documents belonging to families from different states, all connected in some way to the towns marked on the basement map. The discovery should have felt like progress, but the cabin was empty. No baby. No suspect, no signs of who had lived there. The crying the hiker heard had stopped completely. It was as if whoever occupied the cabin had predicted the search and left only minutes before authorities arrived. Even the ground outside offered few clues. Snow had fallen lightly during the night, covering most of the footprints. Still, officers managed to follow a faint trail of prints leading away from the cabin and into the surrounding forest. The tracks continued for miles, weaving through dense trees and rough terrain. They moved with purpose, showing no signs of hesitation or panic. Whoever made them was comfortable navigating the wilderness. Eventually, the trail led to the edge of a steep cliff overlooking a frozen river. The footprints ended abruptly. There were no marks suggesting a fall, no dragged snow, no signs of a rope or climbing equipment. The person simply vanished. As days passed, the cabin was examined thoroughly. Nothing new emerged. Investigators feared the intruder had relocated again, slipping back into the shadows with the same precision they used at the Kane house. Just as the case seemed ready to fade into another unsolved mystery, a small package arrived at the Willow Ridge Police Department. It was addressed anonymously, with no return information and no fingerprints on its surface. Inside the package was a single photograph. It showed a baby with bright eyes and a small crescent-shaped birthmark near the right ear. The infant appeared healthy, wrapped in a new blanket. The picture was recent, taken after the disappearance. On the back of the photo, written in neat handwriting, was a single sentence: "She will never be found until the house is chosen again." The message implied that the crimes were part of a cycle, tied not to individuals but to a location. The kidnapper seemed confident, almost taunting, as if the pattern would continue until someone understood its meaning. Eden was alive, but her fate remained hidden within a mystery built over decades. The house on Larchwood Lane was no longer just a crime scene. It was part of something deeper, something that had yet to fully reveal itself.